great pleasure, the Tidewater Jewish community welcomes Jim Woolsey.
I think this microphone's working okay. 22 years in courtrooms, I just can't stand behind podiums. I really was honored to be asked to address this group this evening, but to tell you the truth, since I spent 22 years as a Washington lawyer and then some time out of the CIA, I'm actually honored to be invited into any polite company. People almost always in the question session after some remarks ask one particular question, and I think I may as well get it out of the way right now. They always want to know, you were only out there at the CIA for a couple of years, you didn't have a background at the CIA, but you at least participated in some of those covert operations. And the answer is, yeah, I did once. And this is a small and discreet group, and I think I can share it. It happened because my wife's and my college reunion came up in the fall of 1993. And we were both in 24/7 jobs at the time. She was Chief Operating Officer managing the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine. And I was doing the CIA, and we decided we needed to take off 3 or 4 days, cash in the old frequent flyer miles, go first class out to California, see old friends, go to the homecoming game, take 3 or 4 days. First thing that happened is my head of security at the CIA came to me and said, Mr. Director, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to have Mrs. Woolsey go on the same flight as you. We cannot have anybody named Woolsey on that flight. I said, but wait a minute, my name's Woolsey. He said, oh, no, sir, you need to fly an alias. And of course, my first thought was, uh-oh, there go the frequent flyer. So, the 2 security men take Sue and me out to the airport. We put her on a United flight, and sitting in the first class seat with her nice glass of Chardonnay, she takes off in a relaxed fashion for San Francisco. They take me to another United flight. As we get on the plane, they stop by the cockpit, show the pilot and chief flight attendant that they're carrying weapons, show the card that says they're federal officers, so they can do that. And so we go back to the back row of coach. It's the 3 seats right in front of the John where you can't even lean back. These are big guys, so I'm sort of wedged here between these 2 big guys for, 6¼ hours or something. Lumber out to San Francisco. As we're getting off the plane and walking up the jetway, flight attendant comes over and whispers something to one of my 2 security men, whose nickname for about 4 reasons was Rock. I had not seen Rock even smile in the 8 months he had been on my security detail, but when this flight attendant whispered something to him, he just cracked up. So I said, Rock, what's so funny? He said, and she said, I've been on these flights for 22 years, and that is the politest and best behaved prisoner that we So, covert op successful, got to California under alias, can't be better than that. Well, I want to share with you this evening some thoughts on energy, and we can talk in the questions and answers about any aspect of that or anything else you want to talk about, national security, whatever. And I find that it helps a lot to look at energy issues from at least 3 different perspectives. And the reason is that energy is not something that is limited in any way. We need it to do everything we do. We need it to plant and harvest crops and eat. We need it to pump water. We need it to power our communications. Our whole society depends in different ways on it. And it is a subject in which it really helps to have different views represented so you can see why people are doing what they're doing. Now, to give you an example, I was testifying before the House Committee on Homeland Security a couple, 3 years ago, and I'm an old Scoop Jackson Democrat, so I'm kind of conservative on defense and foreign policy issues and kind of liberal on some domestic stuff. Well, I was testifying about climate change and national security. And I said, I think there is something. I don't really necessarily think all climate change is anthropogenic and caused by humans, but I think some of it may be, and here's why I think it's an issue. And one of the congressmen had worked together with me, very conservative congressman, had worked together with me on national security things several times, and he was sort of shocked and surprised to see my saying something about climate change. And so he started to kind of beat on me with his questioning. And finally I said, Congressman, look, set aside climate change. You realize I've suggested 5 things we do, and all of them would make us less vulnerable to terrorist attacks and oil cutoffs. He said, oh, well, if you do them for that reason, it's fine. People often get more locked in to their reason for something being done than they do focus on how to get something done, and especially how to build coalitions doing it. Because the only way we get things done in a democracy is people with different but overlapping interests able to come together and do something. We can all hope that next year Congress and the President will have rediscovered that ancient thought. We have to have an understanding that there could well be a number of different reasons, as the Congressman and I demonstrated, to do a single thing. So the way I have talked about this for the last several years is to look at energy issues through 3 perspectives. John Muir, founder of the environmental movement in the United States, founder through his close friend Teddy Roosevelt of the National Park System, founder of the Sierra Club, Mr. Environment, Mr. Green. So when we're talking and looking at things through Muir's eyes, it'll be about the importance of Mother Earth, climate change, and all of it. Second, energy, of course, deals with national security and interacts with it in a lot of ways. The individual I've chosen to represent the national security perspective is George S. Patton. The reason I picked Patton instead of a soldier statesman like Marshall or Eisenhower or something is I wanted somebody who, no compromises, going to protect the country, defeat its enemies, don't give me any crap about anything else. So, fine, I let George into our small little group here. And then finally, there are 1.5 billion people in the world who have essentially no access to electricity or diesel or anything. They cook on dung fires in African villages and huts. They are extremely poor, but they're going to start getting more and more energy in one way or another, and the way they get it could well have a substantial effect on what we do and what is available for us. So I decided that the best person to talk to, or have talk to us, to give us the perspective of this bottom 1.5 billion and the citizens of the small village in India or China or any place else, was Mahatma Gandhi. Because Gandhi, of course, spoke for those who didn't have energy or indeed anything else. He was very committed to the village. He used to carry on his human rights marches, the Salt March, for example, he'd carry a chakra, which is an Indian spinning wheel, and it's what's at the center of the Indian flag. It has significance in the Hindu religion as well. But he carried the spinning wheel, and he would sit in the middle of the march. He'd sit down for a couple of hours a day with these thousands and thousands of people around him and spin cotton into cloth. What he was saying was, look, a modern consultant would say, you've got to move up the value chain. what he was saying was, why in the world would you grow cotton and ship it off to England to have it turned into cloth? You've been making cloth in Indian villages for many, many centuries. Do yourself locally what you can reasonably do, and that makes you more independent and more politically powerful and more economically powerful. So Gandhi is my third ghost. And I will confess to you that sometimes, if the group is small and dinner, and maybe a little bit of wine on the table, I will channel these three guys. Because Muir is pretty easy. He's always stroking his long white beard and talking with his Scottish accent. Patton cusses the hell of a lot and spins his pearl-handled revolvers. And Gandhi is very polite. I'm not going to subject you to any further channeling this evening because we have substance to get into, but it adds to one's ability to sometimes to see these issues through the eyes of these three. Now let's look at our energy system through these eyes. Basically, we've got two main energy systems in the country, and with very limited degree, except for a very limited degree, they don't have much to do with one another. One is electricity generation. It used to be over half coal. Coal is now nosedived. It's down under 40%. Natural gas is climbing fast because it's much cheaper with hydrofracturing. So coal and gas make up between them 80% or so of our electricity generation. Hydropower and nuclear power do the rest. There's a little bit of renewables out there, wind farms and so forth, but not much. Now you'll notice the one fuel I didn't mention in that chain was oil. The reason is we don't make electricity out of oil anymore. We did up until the early 1970s when the Saudi oil embargo got everybody's attention. And so we moved away from using oil to generate electricity. It went from 20% down to less than 1% today. Why is it important to remember this? Because somewhere between 99 and 100% of political speeches from anybody, presidential candidates, anybody else, tend to begin like this. We have a terrible problem with energy, imported oil. We have to do something about it. Let's deploy solar, or let's deploy a nuclear power plant. Nonsense. Those decisions are important decisions. They have nothing to do with oil. When you are talking about producing electricity, you are talking, and you link it to oil, you are talking about well under 1% of the problem. You are 99% off base, either using 1970s statistics or just cooking them up, whatever. First politician who says foreign oil is a problem, let's build a nuclear power plant, let's build a solar farm, turn on your earphones to listen to jazz or classical or whatever you do out there in the audience when somebody is talking pure nonsense, because you know he doesn't have the foggiest idea what he's talking about. There are some footnotes here. I drive 2 electric cars, not simultaneously. My wife I think there's some real promise in electricity for transportation and so forth. We're talking now about what exists today and will exist in the near future to a substantial degree. And that electricity system is today completely separate from our transportation energy system. Transportation around the world is approximately 95% fueled by oil products. Aviation fuel, diesel, gasoline mainly. It is a situation whereby not only does oil have a monopoly over transportation, yeah, you can, crew races, sailing races, marathons, pedicabs, a few trolleys, fox hunts, those all go without oil. But that's about it. Everything else that moves needs oil products of one kind or another. And not only does oil have a monopoly on our transportation, but OPEC, holding 78%, over 3/4, of the world's reserves of proven conventional oil, OPEC holds that 78%, and it is therefore a cartel, a monopoly in restraint of trade. Why? It behaves just exactly like John D. Rockefeller did at the beginning of the 20th century. If he gets a competitor and the competitor is trying to undercut him in costs, he turns on the pumps, drives the price of oil down, bankrupts the competitor, and then takes it back up again. That's the way cartels work. By the way, there are some marvelous quotes, I don't have it with me this evening, from three left-wing nuts. Adam Smith, Friedrich von Hayek, and Milton Friedman, probably the three greatest conservative economists in history since the 18th century. All three say the biggest enemy of free markets is cartels. The first job of any government is to break cartels so that you can have a real market. We'll come back to that in a minute. But it is important, I think, that oil has those monopolistic characteristics, and that is something that also can conceivably be an Achilles heel for it. We'll come back to that in a moment. I think that it's also important to realize that with over 3/4 of the world's oil, OPEC only exports something on the order of just under 1/3 of the oil that's sold around the world. So if you have 78% of something and you're only selling 1/3 of the market each year, I would say that's yet another example of your being a monopoly in restricted trade. So you kind of wonder why gasoline is priced as high as it. Some of us can kind of remember. I remember growing up, learning to drive in Oklahoma in the late 50s on 25-cent a gallon gasoline. I thought that's what gasoline was always supposed to cost. What is behind this situation? Well, it's being able to dictate prices by threatened or real ramping up and ramping down of prices in order to maintain that monopoly. And none of us should pretend any differently about oil. Maybe oil has one huge advantage over other energy systems. It is easy to move it, and it puts a lot of energy into a relatively small volume. So once you get the sulfur out, after you go for it, say in Saudi Arabia, you put it on ships and take it all over the world relatively affordably, and that's its strength. Everything else about it creates some difficulties, I think, but that is its strength. So we have these two major segments of energy in the world, and even sharper in the United States. And let me say a word about those two energy systems from the perspective of my three ghosts. And let's see if we can come up with anything that they might be able to agree on and cooperate on. First of all, the electric grid. I sort of feel like Henny Young, take the electric grid, please. It was built beginning in the 1880s. Some of its components still date from then. It does a good job, when nothing interferes with it, of moving large amounts of electricity around the country and Canada, and we benefit from it, we need it. But electricity has a very serious problem in its control systems. The so-called SCADA, Supervisor Control and Data Acquisition Systems, which are the command and control of the electric grid, unfortunately operate since around the late 1990s over the internet. As we went out in the late 90s and fixed Y2K, remember Y2K, we had to rework all of the software for all the computers. Everybody was so enthusiastic about this relatively new thing called the web. He said, I've got a great idea. Let's put the control systems on the web. We won't have to be making phone calls to one another and so forth. It's cheap. People keep inventing more and more software. Well, what a great idea. Well, we did. We put it on the web. And today, the consequence of that is that if somebody tells you he's working on a smart grid, say, what does that mean to you? That means you can take your cell phone and you've got an app and you can turn down the air conditioning at home in the middle of the day in August so you save some electricity. That's what you're doing? Oh yeah, that's smart grid. That's what we're doing. Do it with web. Do you think you're also making it possible for a teenager in Shanghai to turn down your air conditioning? Deer in the headlights. Afraid you usually are. Everything is connected with everything else over the web, and it was put together by several, I know a couple of them, very, very smart folks at great universities, who both were extremely inventive and also to some extent kind of 1960s flower children. And so the idea was, hey, everybody gets access. What could go wrong? Everybody's in it together. Isn't that wonderful? If we flash forward a few decades from that into WikiLeaks of a few months ago, where one teenage private first class got into the classified version of the web, CyberNet, which was modeled after the web, just a separate one for classified material from the Defense and State Department. And he figured out how to get into it and print out thousands and thousands of diplomatic cables to turn over to the press, some of which got people killed. Because it's only known in the classified cable that the Minister of Defense said the Prime Minister's an idiot. Because, you know, yeah, people got killed because the PFC did that. Now, it shows, however, the nature of the web. And it shows, at least to me, that for the foreseeable future, we're going to have a very hard time getting off of that system. Especially if we try to do it by reforming the web or reforming the overall command and control system of the electric grid. We don't have anybody in the United States who's in charge of the electric grid. We got 50 groups of people called public utility commissions that are in charge of the grid, sort of, kind of. We have an outfit called FERC in Washington, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that regulates transmission. They have some real expertise, but they're not in charge of security. The closest thing is something called NERC, the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, NERC. NERC is several hundred utilities in a trade association. In a statute a few years ago, they got some sort of holy water sprinkled on them, and they get to come out with statements from time to time about security and reliability. But, you know, we are at the verge of being in something as serious as a war with Chinese hackers, Russian hackers, terrorists, and so forth. Has anybody ever heard of a war being won when the commanding general was several hundred retired utility executives in their company NERC? I don't think so. I think we have a really serious problem from the point of view of the vulnerability of the web and the grid. In Cleveland, about 5 years ago, in a summer storm, a tree branch touched the power line. And there was some confusion for a couple of hours, but then they started to take action, and within about 40 seconds, some 80 gigawatts of power, 80 nuclear power plants worth of power went offline, blacked out the northeastern United States and much of eastern Canada, cost the two economies over $50 billion. Some of these areas stayed out for weeks. The real problem is, I know what I wanted to make sure you knew, is that we decided as soon as this happened that we would try to take the stance of the kids in South Park and blame Canada. But the Canadians pointed out in their somewhat understated and droll way that actually Cleveland is south of Lake Erie, not north, and it had been our power line and our tree branch. And we finally had to fess up. Well, the real point of this is that terrorists and disciplined Russian hackers and Chinese hackers are a hell of a lot smarter than tree branches. They can focus on the weaknesses, as the private first class did. So, as long as we're on the grid, we have as huge a reform job to undertake as has ever been attempted in world history with a piece of machinery, the electric grid, that absolutely dominates our country. That suggests to me that we ought to keep in mind some way to get around that problem as we look at the other issues. Now, what does Muir think about electricity? Muir's big thing is anti-coal. He'd just as soon not have to use natural gas if he doesn't have to, but it's only half the CO2 of coal and none of the other pollutants. So Muir is generally inclined to want renewables whenever we can do it, build solar farms, build wind farms. Natural gas is kind of tolerable, coal is not. Pretty straightforward position. What about Patton? Patton doesn't care that much what you use to produce electricity as long as it's not vulnerable. Patton is worried to death about the electric grid and the command and control system. And Patton figures that insofar as you can make a system operate in such a way that the generation of energy is distributed, and the amount of energy that you need to run this building is, best of all, or at least a substantial share of it, created in this building, let's say by solar on the roof and batteries in the basement to save the electricity till nighttime when you need it. So Patton doesn't give a damn about CO2. He doesn't care if you do that with coal, or you do it with electric, you do it with gas, or you do it with whatever. But he doesn't want things operating in such a way that if one tiny thing over here fails, something half a continent away over here collapses too. Gandhi, surprisingly enough, almost completely agrees with Patton for a completely different reason. The reason I mentioned it first, the village. Gandhi wants the village to be able to have its own energy in order to be able to stand up to people who would push it around. Mobutu was probably the worst dictator, African dictator in a long time. One of the first things Mobutu did when he became dictator in Congo was to shut down all of the, there were several, regional power plants and have only one large one that he controlled, so that if a village was causing him trouble, he just shut off their electricity. Gandhi doesn't want that to be the fate of the bottom 1.5 billion of the world. And he also wants them to have cheap and affordable and available energy so they can lift themselves out of poverty. And that means, as far whatever can be done affordably, he's in favor of, but he keeps hearing things that bother him about these big power plants. The World Bank and other people loan money for them, and they get designed, but they somehow never get built. You know, some people steal stuff, corruption in the country, whatever. If you look at a satellite photograph taken in the middle of the night of sub-Saharan Africa in the late 1960s, when we first started taking satellite photos, except for the area around Johannesburg and around Lagos in Nigeria, where there's some light, virtually the entire rest of the continent is dark. If you look at a reconnaissance satellite photo taken within the last few weeks of sub-Saharan Africa at night, it looks exactly the same. Because almost none of these big projects, whether it's a coal-fired plant or a nuclear power plant or a giant dam, almost none of those actually get built and are operating. You can go over the records of the World Bank and all this, it's very straightforward. It just doesn't work. So Gandhi thinks we've got to start doing some things at the village level, and we've got to make it affordable. Maybe we can make it affordable by people not having to have as much electricity as would be ideal, but again, the difference between none and some is huge. There are already companies in South Asia, one in Bangladesh, that sell for about $25, which is a lot of money in a Bangladesh village, but nonetheless, for about $25, a small direct current system, no need to process the electricity so it goes from direct to AC from DC. All you do is you have in that little kit 2 or 3 tiny lights, but they're good enough LEDs the kids can read by them. A very small radio, a cell phone charger, and a tiny fan. All of these things have been selected because you really, really need them in Bangladesh or southern India. So for $25 and no continual payments, because you're not buying any electricity from anybody, you've got something that lets your kids read at night, lets your wife charge her cell phone without her having to walk 10 miles to the nearest guy with a diesel generator, etc. So Gandhi thinks, you know, as long as it's small, as long as the family controls it, as long as it really gets energy to them, even a little bit of energy, he's in favor. So I would say that the resolution of the vectors of these 3 comes out pretty close when you look at exactly what sort of systems they'd be interested in. I think you were talking about an evolution toward having some electricity in your office building, in the local police station, in the local hospital, at your home, so that it's still hooked up to the grid where you have one. But if the grid fails, the software designed in such a way that you can island, as it's called, and still keep operating to some extent. You can find out what's going on in the world, you can call people, your kids can read at night, etc. That type of off-grid or on-grid unless islanded system is something that very much appeals to Gandhi. And Patton says, hey, as long as the enemy can't take it down, I'm for it. This looks kind of sensible and interesting. Let's go with it. And Muir, hey, it's solar. What's not to love from Muir's point of view? Is these systems get bigger, as the batteries get better and get cheaper, you begin to be able to have more and more of your electricity available from islanding and from locally generated essentially power building capabilities. All three of these ghosts are really very surprised at the degree to which they agree, because they've never met before. They don't like each other very much. They come from some completely different backgrounds, and they're interested in completely different aspects of energy. But they all kind of consolidate behind having an increasing amount of energy over time available, but still starting with having something that's affordable, doing it with something that's renewable, and doing it in such a way that it's secure and can't be damaged by others. There are other variants on this. Natural gas offers an opportunity to, especially now with shale gas, with it being located in so many parts of the world, natural gas may offer an opportunity to supply more, so you're not just on the sun, and you can do a rather major share of what your building needs, but from locally available short pipelines, natural gas. Well, Muir is a little grumpy at that because he likes solar better, but he's a reasonable guy. He could go along with that to some extent. So there is a pattern here of a combination of local generation resilience, cleanliness, and security that makes this look kind of acceptable, at least, to all three of my ghosts. Now, what do they think about transportation? Well, start with Muir. Oil. Muir says, yeah, I know. We got the lead out in the 1970s after having had lead to increase octane in gasoline-powered cars for half a century. But after we got the lead out, Muir says, do you know what the oil companies and the automobile companies did? They said, well, we do need higher octane with the new high compression ratio engines that were coming out of the 20s and 30s. And so here's what we'll do. We'll take a byproduct of refinery called benzene, together with some other so-called aromatics, toluene and xylene. And we'll put about a quarter of your gasoline tank will be full of those things. And that increases octane. Only one little problem. Boyden Gray and Andrew Varco wrote a very fine piece 5 years ago in the Texas Review of Law and Politics on octane. And basically, benzene is highly carcinogenic. That sweet smell you smell when you're pumping gasoline, if you're leaning over, that's the smell of cancer. Boyden and Andrew looked through a large number of studies, and they say somewhere between 100 and 200 billion, with a B, dollars each year cost in shortened lives, tens of thousands of shortened lives every year, and increased incidence of cancer. So other than that, Muir says, perfectly fine to boost octane with benzene and toluene and xylene. And can't we get away from this some way? Well, Patton says, you can't believe how much I hate oil. He said, not only can idiots close the Strait of Hormuz, but we, in trying to get our troops and resupplies to them up through the mountains of Afghanistan by driving in trucks, we lose a Marine or a soldier every few convoys by having to get through there. And you just can't think of anything that is more of a problem than POL, petroleum supplies, in combat. Interesting history on this. The Germans found this out the hard way in late 44 and early 45 because they essentially had one refinery under their control, Ploiești in Romania, and they had one large Fischer-Tropsch plant near Dresden that produced diesel fuel from coal. A very, very smart U.S. Army Air Corps general with the marvelous name of Tooey Spatz convinced, after some months of trying, Eisenhower and then Roosevelt himself, we ought to take out both Ploiesti and the Fisher Trophy plant. And we did at the end of 44 and beginning of 45. And by February of 45, the German forces that were coming back up the boot of Italy to get back to Germany, a number of them, the tanks were being pulled by oxen. The Germans found out the hard way how much you need fuel. You can really only understand the Battle of the Bulge, the sweep through the Ardennes, and its goal as to why the Germans did it, in order to get at the fuel dumps in Belgium and have access to the fuel that they desperately needed. Oil is the lifeblood today of military operations. And Patton's thought is, if we can do something to reduce that, something to move in some other way, whatever it is almost, I'm in favor of it. Gandhi says, well, you Americans complain because with oil and your reserves of it and what you have to purchase, you are now in the business of borrowing about $1 billion, or spending about $1 billion a day just for imported oil. It equates to a tax on each American family of about $4,000 per year per family. And those are not tax dollars that go to resurface roads in Virginia or go to pay the Marine Corps. They go into the pockets of Saudi princes and Russian crooks and others. So, Gandhi says, if you think you have a national security problem and an economic security problem from oil, what about us? If oil at $4 or $5 a gallon for you and more like $15 a gallon in South Asia, if it makes things bad for you, think how much worse it makes us for us. It's the major thing that weakens our economy, is having to buy this damn stuff. What can we do about it? Well, they put their heads together and they say, look, we have different ideas about the virtues of free enterprise system, but it is at least interesting that if oil had a competitor, we might be able to get oil prices down, and if the competitor were cheap enough by transferring some of the business to the competitors, we could maybe do a lot better. Now, all three of these ghosts are interested in electricity for vehicles, but they figure it's going to be a while coming in any substantial numbers. And mainly it's work on batteries that is needed. But the main thing is that today in Brazil, as a consumer of fuel, you are in charge. Because the Brazilians have a double growing season for sugarcane down in the south, and exactly the right kind of land for sugarcane, ethanol, grain alcohol, is quite inexpensive in Brazil. So what do? They tell the Americans and anybody else who's going to ship them a car to sell, make it so it runs on both gasoline and ethanol or any mix of the two. And the car companies fluster, and the Brazilians say, no, do it. And today, you know what you have to do to a Chevy Suburban to modify it to be a flex fuel vehicle and burn ethanol as well as gasoline in any mixture? It takes two things. One is you get somebody at the shop to open up the car's computer and you put a pre-designed software package in, and then you shut that up. And the other thing you have to do is really hard. You have to get a silver-colored chrome thing that says flex fuel vehicle, and you parts numbers on a Chevy Suburban shipped to Brazil that says flex fuel vehicle, one in the United States that's sold as a flex fuel vehicle, and one in the United States that's sold as not a flex fuel vehicle, they are the same car. The automobile companies get some special credits under the CAFE for producing flex fuel vehicles, and I think they're afraid if they overdo it too much and let people know how easy it is, they might not get any of the credits anymore. I don't know what they're doing, but in any case, that is easy. What would you have to do, Patton asks, to do that for our delivery vehicles, Jeeps, and so forth, and be able to use methanol with an M, so-called wood alcohol, but made from natural gas? We make methanol from natural gas now. If you go down to on the highway, a hardware store, pick up a gallon of methanol, it'll be about $1.05. What do you need to do? It's about half the energy of gasoline, so you need 2 gallons to equal a gallon of gasoline, so it's a total of $2.10 compared to gasoline prices today. What do you need to do in order to drive that Chevy Suburban on methanol as well as ethanol? Well, you need to change a couple of O-rings and 1 or 2 other things in the fuel system. There are 3 estimates on how expensive that would be. One from MIT is $90, a one-time cost. The other, second one, from General Motors is $70, a one-time cost. And my friend Bob Zubrin, who writes for National Review Online and is a physicist or chemist, I guess, and does his own experiments and all this and this, Bob says, no, it's 41 cents. It's 1 O-ring. So somewhere between 41 cents and $90 per vehicle, we can tell Patton, you can run on gasoline, ethanol, or methanol. You don't like ethanol because you're worried about the food fuel thing? Okay, don't do it. Drive into the filling station and choose. You can choose to stay on gasoline. You can choose to drive on methanol. Up to you. Now, if I told you the name of the country in addition to Brazil that is moving out very smartly with this business of flex fuel for methanol and gasoline so its consumers can have a choice as to what to drive on and let the free market operate, you might be a little surprised if I told you that that free market loving company for transportation fuel is Communist China. In several provinces of Communist China, you can drive into a filling station and be as flexible in fueling with gasoline, ethanol, or methanol as the Brazilians are with gasoline and ethanol. Next time you can corner a politician, ask him why the United States, against the clear instructions of Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and Adam Smith, are refusing to break a cartel, but even though the Communist Chinese are using fuel flexibility to break a cartel. Just see what they say. I'd be kind of interested. So, flex fuel is not the only thing one can do, but it does open up a number of possibilities. For example, all electric vehicles are extremely expensive because you need a lot of battery power. But I drive now a Prius that's been modified for a few $1,000s to have an extra battery, 5 kilowatt-hour battery. It costs me about 2 cents a mile to drive, whereas in gasoline today you're in the range of 15 to 20 cents a mile. I had to pay for the battery, that's true. But I drive about 20, 25 miles in the Prius, all electric, every day, before you have to switch and use liquid fuel. Well, half the cars in the country go less than 25 miles a day, so every other day I'm an all-electric car. Combinations of smaller batteries, more affordable, simpler, together with flex fuel, would mean that since I average over time about 90 miles per gallon of gasoline, because some of it is electricity, if that were a flex fuel Prius, as well as being a plug-in hybrid with its electricity, so I could drive on methanol, let's say, I would be getting, let's say you have to have 15% gasoline for cold weather starting, I would be getting somewhere between 400 and 500 miles per gallon of gasoline, the rest being electricity or methanol. So, my three ghosts, Buer strokes his beard, Patton twirls his revolvers, Gandhi blesses us all, and they say, well, you know, I didn't know that it was going to be quite this straightforward. With electricity, we produce as much locally as we can, as simply as we can. We grow the local production. We use the grid as long as we need the grid. We all admit that if we have an aluminum plant on the outside of town, we're not going to be able to operate that on solar cells on its roof. You're going to need the electric grid to do that. But if when the power goes down from a hacker or anything else, we can still have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of the electricity we'd otherwise have, then, well, hell, let's go turn off the beer refrigerator in the basement and make a sacrifice or two. So they see from completely different perspectives what can be done in electricity, and they see what can be done with oil. Gandhi kind of sums it up for everybody on oil. He says, you know, the reason I carried my salt march was that the British were taxing salt, and we all need salt. And he said, I've looked back into the history of this, and you realize that salt was the only way to preserve food for thousands of years. And even after canning was invented in the 19th century, it was the only way to preserve meat. So salt was a strategic commodity, very much the way oil is today. We can't get by without oil. We couldn't get by without salt back then. And what happened to salt is that in the late 1880s, as the first electric grid started coming online in northern United States and elsewhere, what happened is that people started to realize they could make these little things called refrigerators that had a little freezer in them. And if you put the meat in the freezer, you could thaw it a long time later. And not only was that cheaper than buying expensive salt, which cartels controlled, it was cheaper, and also the meat was better, because you didn't have to soak it in salt brine. So we had an improvement in technology that improved the taste of the meat and reduced the price of the meat. What's not to like? So as that went forward and has produced what it does today, salt is still around. There's still an international market in salt, probably one in the futures market. Salt is still used, at least in Washington, in February on the sidewalks. Tastes good on corn on the cob. Salt has lots of uses. Nobody tells anybody not to use salt. But salt got beaten in a technological race. And now, you're not going to go into breakfast in the morning and look at the salt shaker and say, you know, I wonder who sold the United States that salt. I wonder if we're salt independent. No. Gandhi says, salt now is boring. And that, my friends, is what we have to do with oil. He says, we just have to make it boring.